Good afternoon. I'm Tom Shanker, Director of the Project for Media and National Security here at GW School of Media and Public Affairs. On behalf of my colleagues and friends, I'm happy to say, Lorenzo Vendino and Seamus Hughes of the Program on Extremism, I'm incredibly honored to welcome you to this first joint symposium on extremism. Thank you all for honoring our safety protocols. Thanks to the GW Police Department for all of their support. A couple of other words of thanks before we start. Andrew Mines of the Program on Extremism has just been tireless in helping set this up. And our project's coordinator, Daria Howard, has been incredible in all of her assistance. Also, the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, Silvio Weisbort's here. Silvio, thank you for all of your support. I could certainly stand here and try to wax eloquent on the importance of our topics today, but the audience here and the numbers watching online prove that. At this point in American history, it is such a vital, and important topic. But we have two panels of experts and a keynote speaker who are far wiser and more articulate on this topic than I am. And so we thank you for being here and for your interest. I say we start the discussion now. I'll introduce the moderator of our first event and turn it over to him. Adam Goldman, a longtime friend and colleague, even if he won't claim me anymore, reports on the FBI for the New York Times, and he was part of a Times team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for reporting on Russia's meddling in the presidential election. Previously, he worked at the Washington Post and at the Associated Press. While there, he and his colleagues revealed the New York Police Department's Muslim spying programs, which also earned him a Pulitzer Prize. Adam's the co-author of Enemies Within, Inside the New York Police Department's Secret Spying Unit and Bin Laden's Final Plot Against America. Adam, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for coming. Let me do a quick introduction. At the end, we have Seamus Hughes. He's the Deputy Director on the Program on Extremism here at GW. To my right, we have Carrie Cordero. She's the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow in the Center for New American Security. Next to her on the right is Thomas Brzozowski. Is that right? Close enough. He's the Counsel for Domestic Terrorism at the Department of Justice. And then to his right is Cynthia Miller Idris. She's a professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University. So I'm going to dive right in, and because I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So why don't I start with Tom? And I just need to make clear that Tom is a senior official at DOJ, has repeatedly declined my request to get coffee. So, Tom, I'm not going to hold that against you at this panel, okay? You're still in good stead with your bosses. Tom, this role as counsel for domestic terrorism sounds a little nebulous. So I was wondering a few things here. What exactly is your role at DOJ, and what do you exactly do in the domestic terrorism space? And I think it might be useful for you to explain to the group what are the elements of a DT case. Typically, what kind of predication does the FBI actually need to open a DT case? And can you break down the DT threat landscape today and what it means for us?
Okay, that's a tall order. I will start at the top by apologizing for ignoring your repeated requests for coffee. There's nothing personal, I promise. I just don't want to get fired. So when I'm allowed to speak on this issue, trust me, it's something that I very much look forward to. So thank you again to Seamus and his team for allowing me the opportunity to address a very important issue. It's a central focus to me, of course, and to the team at the National Security Division. So I'll start off with just a quick sketch of what it is that you do. I get that from my wife all the time. It's like, what do you do actually every day? And it's a lot of everything that concerns domestic terrorism. So I'll break it up into maybe three components. There's a policy element to it, there's an operational element to it, and then there's a training and engagement element to it. So on the policy side of the house, a lot of what I do concerns coordinating policies as they relate to domestic violent extremism across the components within the Department of Justice. And there are a number of those components, many of which have a piece of the DT puzzle, if you will. The primary driver, of course, is the National Security Division, but other divisions within the department also have a central role, including the Civil Rights Division, for example, the Tax Division, the Criminal Division, et cetera, et cetera. I coordinate or assist in coordinating domestic terrorism-related policies with elements outside of the Department of Justice, with other federal agencies, for example, through the auspices of the National Security Council and the White House. So I participated, for example, in the crafting the White House's new domestic terrorism strategy to counter the new strategy to counter domestic terrorism, for example. One of many, many, many participants, but that was part of my role. I spent quite a bit of time briefing members of Congress on issues related to domestic terrorism, or preparing our senior officials, including the Assistant Attorney General for National Security and the Attorney General, for testimonies at congressional hearings on domestic terrorism. I do a lot of policy developments on as they relate to domestic terrorism with our state and local partners. And then recently, there's been a significant uptick in what we understand to be transnational domestic terrorism. So I've, believe it or not, spent quite a bit of time in multilateral and bilateral engagements with foreign partners on a range of issues that touch on transnational domestic terrorism, including a lot of overseas engagements in places like Malta and Berlin and elsewhere, which is a departure from what I normally do, but a welcome one, I have to say, in the sense that it does allow me to interact and engage on these issues with foreign partners who are equally concerned with them. That's the policy piece. Shifting to the operations piece, as you might expect, I work very closely with the FBI to maintain a good sense of the operating picture or the intelligence picture that's going on across the country at any one time. So, for example, this morning we had our weekly meeting with the folks that run all the domestic terrorism investigations across the country, and I would sit in on that just so I have a sense of what's going on. I'm not going to do a deep dive in every case, but I'll have familiarity with most of the investigations that are going on at any time. And then I assist as needed, of course, with specific cases in the field as they relate to domestic violent extremism. That's the operations picture. And then training and engagement, a ton of training for our FBI agents and federal prosecutors out there on domestic terrorism issues. A ton of training with our federal partners, DOD, state, DHS, Treasury, et cetera, on issues that relate to domestic terrorism. And then training with our state and local partners. But I have to say, before I pivot to your other question, that the real work in connection with domestic terrorism really is on the ground, in the field, in the street with our state and local partners who are engaging with this every single day. And the FBI agents that bring the cases, investigate the cases, and the local DAs who prosecute this, and the federal prosecutors who bring domestic terrorism-related cases. That's the tip of the spear and where the real work actually gets done. So pivoting to your question concerning what does the FBI need to initiate an investigation in the first place, I'm going to caveat this out of the gate with I'm not in the FBI. I used to be in the FBI for a little bit, but I don't want to get sideways with my brethren over across the street, so I'm going to give you my best sense of it based on where I sit. And you can certainly, of course, consult the FBI directly if you'd like any follow-up questions. But what they'll tell you in the main is that before they initiate a domestic terrorism investigation, they typically need three components. Namely, they have to identify a potential federal violation. That's what gives the FBI jurisdiction in the first instance, as I'm sure you're aware. And then second, they have to identify some sort of ideology that might be in play. And then thirdly, and most importantly, they have to identify an element of violence. They have to get some sense, and it's important to understand what we mean by violence. So, for example, they're not going to be interested in a self-styled neo-Nazi who just happens to rob a bank because he is out of money and he needs to get some more money for himself. That is not going to be a basis to initiate a domestic terrorism investigation, even though you've got a self-styled neo-Nazi. Even though you've got violence, the components have to be arranged in a particular manner. And that is to say, they are looking for instances where someone is looking to give expression to a particular ideology through violence. And that's the key component there to understand. So if they have those things, that'll give them the wherewithal to initiate a domestic terrorism investigation.
Or you could do a tax fraud or drug fraud or some other federal, it wouldn't just be violence, right?
Well, you're referencing the federal predicate because remember, right out of the gate, I said they have to identify the potential for a federal violation.
Right.
Now, that federal violation can be anything.
All those components in DOJ you talked about.
Exactly. It could be a tax violation. It could be a fraud violation. It could be a criminal civil rights violation or anything. But they've got to identify some kind of federal violation to give them that jurisdictional hook in the first instance. If you like, I can pause now, or would you like me to touch on the
You could, if you want to touch on the last one briefly.
yeah.
Sure.
So typically the FBI will talk about how they assess the threat in terms of 5 distinct categories. One of which is the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, which I'm sure most of us have heard so much about. As it relates to the threat picture, the contemporary threat picture, you will hear the director of the FBI and senior officials in the DOJ consistently say that the primary threat is and remains lone offenders that are affiliated with either homegrown violent extremism or domestic violent extremism. And these are individuals that are typically, in the main, not on the FBI's radar at any particular moment before they commit a particular attack. That is and remains the #1 threat. And regrettably, Buffalo is a prime example of how that threat tends to materialize. There are also, second category, it concerns animal rights and environmental extremism. The third category concerns abortion-related extremism. The fourth category concerns anti-government or anti-extremist related extremism.
Agave. For all of you out there.
Exactly, not the tequila kind either. And within that, you'll have a variety of subcomponents, including militia violent extremists, anarchist violent extremists, for example, or sovereign citizen violent extremists. And then our fourth category, of course, is basically big O for other, because as we've seen over the past couple of years, there's been a surge in idiosyncratic blended ideologies where our subjects are kind of cherry picking bits and pieces from various ideologies and crafting their own idiosyncratic ideology and then giving expression to that through violence. That is domestic terrorism, to be sure, but it would probably be addressed in the O category. I've already touched a little bit in terms of the threat picture on the increasingly transnational component to this. That is of significant concern. Just last week, or last month, I should say, we held the first counterterrorism law enforcement forum with our brethren from the State Department and the government of Germany in Berlin to address this very issue. And then just on Monday, the Deputy Attorney General was at a public engagement, and she identified, rightly so in my view, threats to public officials as an issue of significant growing concern for the FBI and the department. So that kind of rounds out the threat picture, and I'm mindful that I've been talking for some time, and so I'll pause there and stand by for any follow-up questions.
Great. Cynthia, let's turn to you since Tom conveniently brought up Buffalo, where a white supremacist, I believe, killed 10 people, correct? And who, in fact, today was just charged with federal hate crimes, I believe. And you know, Tom had mentioned, you know, he was sort of a lone offender, not on the FBI's radar. So I guess, Cynthia, I would ask you, you know, how do you prevent Buffalo, and is there even a legal way to do that, or is it just a casualty we have to accept in this environment?
Well, is this on?
You got to flip it forward. The top. There
Got it. That's better, right? Thanks for the question. That's a big question. How do you prevent it? I mean, it would help if we had started a lot earlier to think about prevention in serious ways in this country, which we haven't really done, to be honest. So I will say that means thinking about prevention not just as reinforcing the doors or barricading the doors or equipping us to stop a crisis at the moment of violence, but really investing in digital and media literacy and early prevention and community-based prevention. So in my lab, Peril, we advocate for a public health model, which is an approach that really looks at equipping people with the tools to make better decisions in their online lives, in their offline lives, to be resilient to propaganda, to disinformation, to conspiracy theories, And we really don't invest in that, in part because we don't have a model for even an agency who would be responsible for that, the way that our federal government is structured. It doesn't really fit into the security agencies or the law enforcement agencies. It's not under the, the auspices of the Department of Education, the way that our education system is set up. So other countries have both, let's say in Germany, a federal agency for civic education, but also funding to the tune of billions of euro available, like in Germany, for community-based prevention work that takes the model as defense of democracy, the idea that you can't meaningfully confront the fringe or prevent the fringe by only focusing on the fringe. You also have to equip the mainstream with all the tools to resist the propaganda that will always come from the fringe. So our approach in this country has really been to focus on the fringe, to try to prevent the fringe from harming everybody else. And I think it's an impossible ask. Even if law enforcement's perfect, which we know they're not, but even if they were perfect, it's like asking them to catch every single case, and those cases are growing. It's a rising bubble. So I think it's an unfair ask, even in a perfect world.
Should we be concerned about, if somebody loves Osama bin Laden, that's not a crime. If somebody loves Adolf Hitler, that's not a crime. Should we be concerned about going into people's house and doing prevention, as some people might say that we're not the thought police?
I think we should absolutely be concerned about First Amendment rights and freedom of speech. But I think, when we switched a couple of decades ago to a public health model of thinking about prevention of cardiac disease and diabetes by investing in communities to teach them about healthy eating habits and exercise, we didn't tell them they had to do that. We just invested in providing them with the information and tools to make better choices for themselves. That's what we mean by a public health approach. We have every hospital, every YMCA has classes in healthy heart habits or whatever, right? That is reduce the incidence of diabetes and cardiac disease so that we're not just left with doctors having to treat the symptoms once it becomes a disease, but you can actually prevent some people. And you also invest in reducing food, deserts and creating better resources for people to have access to things, reduce grievances, right? I mean, there's lots of different ways that a public health approach could prevent the incidence of radicalization and violence, but it isn't about, telling people what to think. It's about equipping them with the tools to understand manipulative online and conspiracy theory type disinformation that we have seen is very persuasive to millions of Americans.
That's a great point. Let me switch to Carrie now. Carrie, I believe the shooter in this Buffalo massacre was plotting a multi-dimensional attack. I'm not sure we've seen this before. Should we be concerned that these domestic terrorists are taking a page out of the ISIS AQ playbook? Those groups use coordinated simultaneous attacks and have done that repeatedly. Are we entering a new phase of domestic terrorism, one that's even deadlier than what we've seen in the past?
So, thanks, Adam, for the question. So let me answer it this way. So what I hear when I talk to folks who are currently in government in positions of responsibility for these issues is that the other category that Tom mentioned, this ideology where people are picking and individuals are picking and choosing from sometimes even intellectually inconsistent ideologies and putting those together and then acting on violence in accordance with them, that is one of the biggest things that leaders in positions of responsibility have to worry about. The Buffalo shooter, my sense is that is the particular kind of one that might be the very hardest to institute prevention, because this is an individual. Now, on the other hand, there were some signs. So part of this we look at from a national security perspective, but part of it is this individual exhibited signs. This individual had access to a weapon. And then that individual acted on those particular things. So I think one of the questions is, to what extent are we is the U.S. government doing a good enough job at the sharing of information level from state, local law enforcement. I know this is an issue that I'm sure the Justice Department is working on, state and local law enforcement with federal. But to widen the lens a little bit from Buffalo in particular, the big issue that I'm concerned about when it comes to our evolving domestic terrorism threat. And so I think the title of this panel is very important because domestic terrorism is not a new issue for the United States. It has been around for a very, very long time. What we're seeing is a resurgence. And what my worry is that the current domestic terrorism, and so this, I take it away from the Buffalo, but more towards the arrest that we saw in Idaho this week, what we saw, the connection from the people in Idaho who were in Charlottesville. What we observed in the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. The biggest change that I think we're seeing is a shift from what were fringe groups, as you guys have described, and now are becoming part of the political movement in the country.
Like the Proud Boys in Florida.
Like the Proud Boys in Florida, taking on positions of, the city council,
Trying to
I believe.
get into elected positions.
So that to me, or the seditious conspiracy charges of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers with respect to the January 6, 2021 prosecutions that the Justice Department has going on right now. So for me, the biggest concern right now is, yes, these isolated incidents, and what more should law enforcement at the state, federal, local level be doing to try to root out these individuals who are going to engage in an act. And maybe we'll come back in the discussion to some of the First Amendment where the lines are in terms of the investigative abilities, because the First Amendment, we respect it, and Justice Department abides by it, of course, but it is not a bar to conducting investigations of individuals who might engage in domestic terrorism. But it's this connection to the broader movements that we see, what I might describe as more of a mainstreaming versus fringe aspect to the domestic terrorism threat.
Carrie, one more. I think it was yesterday, we just had another Army reservist from Washington arrested as part of the J6 investigation. Can you, and of course that wasn't the first, can you talk a little bit about extremism in the military and what you're seeing? And is the Pentagon taking this issue seriously, moving the head off any threats? I think the idea of people getting military training, having access to high-powered firearms, and then embarking on, a plot to kill as many people as property is pretty scary.
Yeah. So thanks for that question. So this is an issue actually at Center for New American Security. We have an ongoing project that I'm doing in collaboration with our Military Veteran and Society program, and we are looking specifically at the question of domestic violent extremism within the military, veteran, and the law enforcement community. And several of my co-panelists here are collaborating with us and providing their expertise and insights into that project as well. And so I'm so grateful for their participation. So what we're finding so far, we'll have a report from CNAS out in the fall on this particular issue. But first off, the engagement of military and veterans in particular acts, again, is not something new. Tim McVeigh, Oklahoma City, 1995, veteran. Weavers, Ruby Ridge, I was just looking this up last night, 1992, veteran. Members of the January 6th insurrection, veterans. So this is not a new issue, but it is an issue that requires a refreshed, acute attention to it. Based on some of the recent activities. We also know that the current group, so examples like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys, they are targeting military veterans and law enforcement personnel. They are targeting them for recruitment because of their skills, capabilities, experience, tactical weapons, knowledge, and abilities. And so they are specifically being targeted. And so one of the things that we're going to try to do in our project is lay this out so that individuals in these communities, military, veteran, and the law enforcement community all across the country has a better understanding that they are being targeted for recruitment by these extremist groups. At the Defense Department, they conducted a review. They did a stand down in the beginning of the administration where they had an all-day stand down across the Department of Defense, had commanders speak with their soldiers, Marines, sailors to discuss extremism ideologies and sort of what crosses the line into violent activity and activity that would be prohibited as an individual who is part of the Defense Department. So they did a big review within the Defense Department. They updated some of their policies and procedures and are working on that. The Department of Homeland Security also did what I would call a preliminary review led by their chief security officer in order to get a handle on whether violent extremism affiliation or activities within members, the law enforcement workforce within the Department of Homeland Security is something that they need to be concerned about. Now, their preliminary review came up with very, very small numbers and sort of came out that they don't think that they have an issue, but they also recognized in the preliminary report that they didn't think they had a good database, a good data collection mechanism to really get a good handle on the problem. So I hope that we'll see more work out of the Department of Homeland Security. I'm also waiting to see whether we see some sort of similar review that DOD and DHS have done out of the Department of Justice, but I haven't yet seen that take place.
Great. Seamus, we now know that the government has charged 3 conspiracies related to J6. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. Oath Creepers, Proud Boys, and then sorry, I'm blanking, the other militia from Texas, 3 percenters, right? The 2 of them are now seditious conspiracies. These, if you read what the government has asserted, these did not just pop up on J6, right? These conspiracies were developed and planned before J6, right? Which leads you to believe, which begs the question, where was the FBI? Where was DOJ? Their job is to detect and thwart acts of domestic terrorism in this country, and they didn't that day. And they even had an informant in Proud Boys who was on the ground and still failed to stop this thing. If nothing else, failed to arrest the members of these conspiracies. So I guess I would ask you, that's where we were before J6 on domestic terrorism. Not to say the FBI hadn't done good work and taken on the racially motivated violent extremists, but they had made a top threat in this country, and they had certainly prioritized that. But lurking underneath were these militias, right? So I guess, Seamus, my question is to you. Okay, how has the U.S. government strategy shifted since January 6th? It's the 1-year anniversary since the domestic terrorism strategy came out. What's changed and where are we now, and are we getting any better at this?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say there has been a complete sea change in the way we do counterterrorism in this country. January 6th happens. It's the largest investigation in the FBI's history. You're talking about 800 plus people that have been charged and arrested, 250,000 tips from the public, 13,000 hours of body cam video, a number of things. You're getting agents that are moved off of different cases to January 6th. U.S. attorneys' offices are sending people to D.C. So they kind of went all in on that investigation post. We can talk about pre. I think there's plenty of information sharing to do it. But if you look at the threat landscape, you saw a number of things kind of blinking red on the lead up to it, whether it be the rallies in Virginia or the FBI director testifying 3 years ago that there was 850 active investigations in all 50 states, and then recently testifying there's 2,700. Right, so you're seeing a dramatic rise in the number of cases that are happening. Now, some of that can be kind of selection bias. You start focusing on domestic terrorism, you get a little bit more cases. I don't think there's a whole lot of truth in that. I think it's more that the threat picture is changing dramatically. And when I say a sea change, I truly mean that. You have FBI agents who, for years, have been working ISIS cases, and analysts have been pulled off of those and are working white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and militia cases. Assisting U.S. attorneys who would never have taken a case federal, would have kicked at the DA, or would have said, you got to go back and work this a little bit more because it's not baked for prime time, are taking chances a little bit more on federal cases. Department of Homeland Security has announced that domestic terrorism is a national priority, which sounds like just nice words, but when in actuality it means the grant funding opens up. So if you're a state and local person trying to look for grant funding, if they name it as a national priority, you can apply for some things there. Department of Defense announced their insider threat review. DHS finally kind of reconstituted, or at least rejiggered, some of the domestic terrorism analysis unit at the INA, which has been, basically shuttered for a number of years too. And this all happens in the same time of a White House review. So January 6th happens. 14 days later, the Biden administration takes over, and I think that day or the next day they announce a 100-day review at the National Security Council to where are we on domestic terrorism. And being a good National Security Council, it ended up being 140 days. But they had a 140-day review, brought the interagency together and said, okay, who's got what, right? And where can we do things? And they announced a strategy 1 year ago today. A strategy was first of its kind. So credit to them for kind of setting the strategic goals, implementations, and things like that. The devil's really in the details, right? What is a strategic implementation plan? When is it going to come out publicly? Who's the lead on this part of their strategy? Are you moving agents over to permanently, or is this a temporary basis on these type of things? And we're seeing that there are some successes. If you talk to folks in the field, they say, we're focusing on this. We've always focused on white supremacy, but now, like, when I actually brief my boss, he pays attention, right? And you're seeing it bubble up from the field offices saying, these are guys who are really actually, it's getting briefed up to Hoover, right? It's somebody's getting that information. So you are seeing a change in it. But at the same time, the threat picture is changing too. If you look at, we had the head of counterterrorism for DHS give a talk 3 or 4 months ago, and he said, yeah, we put out the strategy 6 months ago, but the threat picture is scarier now. It's more complex, it's more convoluted, and it's all over the map. And DHS put out their National Threat Advisory last week. Didn't get a whole lot of coverage, I think, because we have a lot of other things happening in this country, unfortunately so. But it basically said there are storm clouds above our heads. It's getting darker, and it's likely going to rain. And whether it be the election coming up, whether it be Supreme Court justice decisions, a number of kind of touch points are happening in the next 3 or 4 months. And DHS is saying the House is going to catch fire if we don't pay attention to this. So the real question becomes now, it's one thing to have a strategy, it's another thing to have an implementation. Like, how sustainable is this? And will Congress work with you? So Department of Justice asked for $50 million more for FBI agents and $100 million more for assistant U.S. attorneys. Well, getting that through Congress right now is going to be a little bit tough, particularly on an issue like domestic terrorism, which is kind of inherently politicized in nature.
Thank you, Seamus. I think I'll just make a point. Since I cover the FBI and building on what Seamus has said and what I've seen for the past year, and I got interested in domestic terrorism, I guess it was a few years ago, right, when it was starting to ramp up at the Bureau, because we had these deadly incidents in Texas and at the synagogue and Pittsburgh and others. And we're talking about macro strategies here, but on the micro, and this touches on something that Tom says, the FBI, they get many of their tips from state and locals. That's how some of these cases actually come to fruition. But the issue here is that for the FBI, these people aren't they're not in touch with terrorists. The FBI can't put secret surveillance FISAs on them and track their emails. So they might not well exist. But for the FBI, they have these big field offices, and then they have these small resident agencies out in the hinterlands, right? And when you think about the tip of the spear, those RAs are really the tip of the spear for the FBI in fighting domestic terrorism. And if those RAs aren't focused on this mission, right, and those agents in those RAs aren't taking this threat seriously, aren't making it a priority, then I have great concerns about will we be effective in fighting domestic terrorism. Not only that, Idaho, what happened with the Patriot Front is a good example of the Idaho police acting swiftly, right? But you can imagine that might not always be the case around the country in these very rural areas, very rural areas where people could be sympathetic to these groups, in particular sheriffs or police officers. And those sheriffs and those cops in these towns and state troopers who are traveling these backwoods roads, if they're not bringing these tips to the FBI, then I think the FBI is going to have to think long and hard about how it's really going to track this threat. And I know there's been some whining in the FBI in particular about spending time on arresting people who committed misdemeanors, right, in the Capitol, right? You can imagine people have other priorities. It could be a kidnapping, right? It could be any there could be child exploitation, right? Other serious crimes. And so I think the FBI really is going to have to figure out a way to manage this crisis. So why don't we open it up, and I'll call on people, and we'll try to make this as orderly as possible. Sir, right there. What, you with the mask on? Yeah, here.
Yeah, I'll share.
Anyone on the panel, how organized is Antifa?
Want me to take it?
Go for it. You want
Stop thinking about Antifa and think about just anarchists and anti-government, okay? This is a very loose, coordinated group of people, right? And how can I tell you that with a certain amount of confidence? Find me one Antifa DOJ conspiracy case. There isn't. They have failed to make a conspiracy case against this so-called movement, right? What you mainly see are a collection of violent left-wing extremists, right, who are getting together and, doing bad things. I'm not trying to mitigate their behavior, but, look what happened under J6 and how quickly these conspiracy cases came together against the militias, right? Against the Oath Keepers, against the Three Percenters, and against the Proud Boys. You're just not seeing that. And under the previous administration, they struggled mightily. It was a priority to make a so-called Antifa conspiracy case, and they couldn't. I remember they did make a conspiracy case in St. Louis in the riots there, and I just was recently reviewing this, and they were, these four guys were just losers. They didn't even know each other. They weren't Antifa. They were just loser criminals who had come together on that night and committed violence, and they were charged. Another interesting point on this is the FBI or DOJ let these search warrants lapse, and Seamus actually pointed them out to me. These were 3 search warrants the FBI had gotten, so they had PC, right? They had probable cause. They went to a judge, and they got search warrants on these 3 people who had apparently come across state lines. The battle of the white supremacists in Charlottesville, and this was a potential conspiracy case against these 3 people who self-identified with Antifa, and they failed to make the case. So these search warrants lapsed, and we were able to review them. They were from, I believe, 2019. Seamus.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I think you could look at kind of left-wing extremism investigations in this country similar to what you would look at right-wing extremism in this investigation in this country 10 years ago, meaning that they tend to be local DAs that are taking the cases for property damage or things like that. Or San Francisco pulled a conspiracy charge at the local level for people that were interacting with, or at least fighting back toward the Proud Boys rally there. So it hasn't risen to a federal level in terms of how they're doing prosecutions by any means. And if you talk to Department of Justice, they'll say if we're racking and stacking concerns, our first concern is going to be kind of white supremacists, anti-government, militia groups, and then everybody else is a 3rd or 4th priority on the landscape. That's not to say it's not being worked at the local level, and you see a lot of prosecutors saying, this is something we want to work on, but at a federal level, it hasn't bubbled up, and that could be kind of prosecutorial discretion in terms of what we look at the prosecution of those search warrants. We could have a variety of different cases, but for the most part, they're kicking them from the federal level down to the local level.
And don't get me wrong, I don't want anybody to misinterpret this. I'm not minimizing the violence on the left. Okay, that's wrong. And if there were crimes, then they should be prosecuted, right? We just haven't seen this type of organization, right? We haven't seen the conspiracy cases charged like we've seen on the right. And there are more cases. If people want to investigate, there's Adam Wathan. These were white supremacists. This is a very dangerous group. DOJ, FBI prioritized. There's the Base, another very dangerous group. These were enterprise cases These were enterprise cases, which is extraordinary. Not only just conspiracy. So, next question. Yep. Military.com.
I was curious, you look at some of these groups like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and stuff like that, and the people that are involved in January 6th insurrection. Is it kind of fair to say most of those people are, frankly, losers? They're not romantically or economically satisfied or anything like that, and that is sort of what has driven them to these extremist groups or ideologies? And if so, is there kind of a tipping point that could be at least broadly spoken.
Who wants to take on the radicalization model of J6?
Well, that frames it in a slightly broader way. I will say, and I think what's the empirical definition of a loser? We've used it a few times, right? So we probably should define it at some point. But I will say that's if you mean unemployed, romantically, unable to build a relationship, that's not exactly what we saw, especially on January 6th. So. We know a lot of those folks were employed. They were older on average than most, than we normally see in terms of violent mobilization. I think the early data that you produced said average age of 40. I think that's ticked upwards slightly over the last year as more cases came, but it's definitely in the 40s, and that's unusual. They were, a lot of them, employed as middle class individuals, upper middle class even. There was an early Washington Post report, though, that was really interesting, and Seamus may know more about how the data panned out after the first couple hundred cases. But that early report showed that there was a disproportionate incidence of histories of tax lien, bankruptcy, and eviction. And so one of the things and sometimes dating all the way back to childhood. So there's a sort of interesting, I think, possible hypothesis there around a sense of precariousness mixed with a sense of entitlement. So I don't say precariousness meaning actually disenfranchised, but a feeling that something could be taken away from you. And that's an empirical question, I think, that has to be investigated. But we know that sense of grievance has played a role in other types of radicalization to terrorism and to violent extremism. So that kind of fear that something could be lost, something could be taken away, perhaps rooted in an actual experience to some extent of bankruptcy, tax lien, or eviction, dating all the way back to childhood in those cases. But that was the first 215 cases or so when that report came out, so it may be not proportionate anymore. But anyway, in terms of radicalization, we know that it's a toxic mix. There's a lot of different stuff going on, lots of emotions that get manipulated by those. Again, so the idea that something could be taken from you or stolen from you shows up again and again in white supremacist propaganda in terms of a white country, majority country being taken. It comes up in Second Amendment protests. It comes up in the Stop the Steal language. So there's, why someone is persuaded by propaganda that says something's going to be taken from you is an empirical question, but we know that propaganda is persuasive. And so that's one of the factors, I would just say.
Next.
I'd add one last thing before we do it. It could be like that we have 40,000 pages of legal documents for January 6 cases on our website, extremism.gw.eu. Look, I did. But my eyes start glazing over after the 800th case, right? And so for me, January 6 is important, but what's really important for me as a researcher and an analyst is looking at what happens after January 6, right? So what happens to those groups? And you see the pressure on the Oath Keepers to the point where they're almost broken, right? The leadership, the hierarchical leadership couldn't withstand the law enforcement pressure. Whereas the Proud Boys kind of regress back into a state and local model, and they have a level of resiliency. You see, Patriot Front getting arrested on Saturday or Sunday. Will we get away from this, what had been post 9/11 of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Revolution Muslim groups like that, of these group dynamics, and get to a point of kind of lone actor individuals, because the FBI uses the predicate of January 6 to open larger investigations and take cases federal that they hadn't before. And that's really where the dynamic's going to change when it looks at domestic counterterrorism efforts in this country.
Yeah, I will say one thing about J6, and I don't know the actual number, but how many people do we think went in the Capitol? 2,000, right? All those names are now indexed in FBI files. Every single one of those names. And imagine how many names associated with those names are now indexed in FBI files. So, their DT base, right, within their are they still using the Sentinel? I can't even remember. Has grown exponentially since J6, which is interesting to think about. You right there? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I just had one question, is that you spoke about grievance, and it's pretty clear that, even if you look beyond the US, senses of victimhood are pretty important in sort of framing a desire or like a proneness to radicalization. And I wanted to ask you, where do we stand on the sort of working with tech companies on the sort of echo chambers that are being created on the internet, because currently there is conversations around breaking up tech monopolies and things like that, but I just feel like these conversations don't really get to the heart of it. They're these tokenistic deplatforming stuff that happens, but really at the root of it is internet that's fragmented and where confirmation bias is rampant. So I just wanted to know a bit more on your thoughts on where is that journey taking us. Thank you.
Sure. So my sense of it is that there, over the years, and this, I think this probably more developed in the international terrorism context, where there has been a lot of coordination and exchange and discussion amongst, at least from the federal government level, and technology platforms is a really, really broad phrase, so I'll use that, but the companies that provide us with communication services or social media services where people communicate. Those types of companies, again, going back to the international terrorism of the early 2000s, back when I was at DOJ, I mean, there's a lot of coordination that has worked, and there's compliance with law enforcement requests, and so there are developed relationships there. What has transformed, I think, is as our focus has shifted to understanding a greater domestic terrorism threat. So then we get into more First Amendment issues. And we also get into the situation where across the board, whether we're talking about rooting out domestic violent extremism or other issues, Congress has been incapable of instituting any regulation on these technology platforms at all. So whether it comes to privacy legislation, whether it comes to these types of issues. So so there is a lack of regulation. There is an environment, I think, where we are developing in this country, at least, an expectation that companies are going to act like governments. So the companies have done a lot internally to develop procedures to try to police their platforms and report information to law enforcement, but companies are not governments, and companies are acting in their commercial interests. And so there is only, in my view, there's only so far that they are going to go without there being a legislative framework in which they are required by law to operate.
Back there, with the glasses. Yes, you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll do you, and then we'll.
Thank you. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm curious if any of you can talk a bit about the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis. I understand they have some overlap in their mission in terms of detecting domestic terrorism and potential threats. Specifically, how are they different compared to the FBI in this sphere? How effective are they, and what challenges do they face?
So I'll start off, and then I don't know if others have thoughts too. So intelligence and analysis, which is a component of the intelligence community but sits within the Department of Homeland Security, has responsibilities and authorities to be able to analyze intelligence information. That includes both international terrorism and domestic terrorism information. What they are not is they are not investigators. And so it's the FBI that has authority to conduct the actual investigations. And that's true whether it's on the international terrorism front or whether it is on the domestic terrorism front. So we had my colleague Christian Beckner, who's an adjunct fellow with us and used to be affiliated here at GW. He's got a paper for us out at CNAS that is on sort of what does a future INA look like. And I think what Christian lays out is that there's a couple different models. We could either really resource and expand the mission of this component to make it be more robust and have greater responsibilities and capabilities to be able to collect intelligence and analyze it to try to prevent against future attacks, whether international or domestic, or whittle it down to something more akin to the State Department's intelligence component, INR, which provides a more limited advice to the policymakers within that department. Very highly respected. INR has a wonderful reputation in terms of its accuracy and its capabilities and its sophistication within the intelligence community for the area that it is responsible for. But I do think we are at a sort of decision point, I hope, where both Congress and the Department of Homeland Security will take a fresh look at it. And thankfully, INA, just as of the last week or so, has a Senate confirmed
Ken
head of
Weinstein.
that component. Yes, my former colleague and boss, Ken Weinstein, who was previously at the National Security Division.
You've been patiently, right there with your multicolored mask, yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question about information sharing. Given some of the problems we know about information sharing, like I'm thinking of the countering violent extremism programs that deputize community members to spy on each other, the latest iteration is CP3. Thinking about fusion centers, where the Senate has found that a lot of the information there is illegal, useless, or both. I'm wondering how you prevent information from these tips, from these problematic programs that involves racial, religious, or ideological profiling from trickling up through the system, and how you control the spread of bad information through this information sharing infrastructure.
You want that, Tom?
Sure.
Let's throw in confirmation bias too as part of that.
The mood in here is taking a shift for the worse. Good Lord. No, you'll understand, of course, that I'm not really in a position to comment directly on programs that are run by the DHS. But you're correct in noting that CP3, as it's kind of colloquially known, more or less has is the lead, if you will, in the government's efforts to conduct prevention efforts in the domestic terrorism arena. And we work closely with them on many other issues. I will tell you that what I can say is that the information that is secured by the FBI during the conduct of domestic terrorism investigations is scrutinized at several levels within the Bureau, and then certainly is going to be taken a hard look at by those national security prosecutors before they elect to bring any sort of process in connection with that information, or ultimately charges, federal charges. I will also note that one of the efforts that we have taken on at the National Security Division as a byproduct of the new domestic terrorism strategy issued by the White House is to engage in more robust information sharing with our state and local partners. And Seamus rightly noted that the proof is in the details, and as a consequence of that, we are presently working through what Seamus noted as the strategic implementation plan of the strategic objectives that were outlined in that strategy, many of which, if you can read it yourself, concern developing more robust mechanisms to engage in information sharing with a wide array of partners, federal partners, state and local partners, civic organizations, entities outside of government, the academy, think tanks, and everything in between. So we're looking to do better in that, but I would take issue a little bit with your premise there, but on the whole, we do recognize we can do better, and we're striving to do just that.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off, Tom. I don't want you to get in trouble.
Can I just add something, which is to say that I think that situation that you describe is one more reason why we need intervention options that are not tied to the federal government or to law enforcement. And so we constantly get calls, emails, referrals from random people who want help, who just Googled me, like a grandfather, a sister, a brother, a teacher, right? They have somebody they're worried about. In the vast majority of cases of mass violence, somebody knew. Somebody had a warning sign, and they often will not call the police. Often the police can't do anything anyway because there's nothing illegal happening yet. And so, when you think about any other social problem, eating disorder, suicide risk, sexual assault, any other problem, addiction, communities know where to get help, and they have a local resource right there. We don't have that. We do not have those kinds of privately funded resources. And maybe it'll take government funding to make it sustainable, but we're building it out with private funding, a foundation, and individual philanthropists who want communities to have resources to engage that are different, that can do assessments and referrals. And I think that's just one of the things that has to happen in this country.
I can do one more quick one, sir.
So, worst case, all of these groups represent a movement, and it's pretty clear they may come to power. What happens if your agency then which they think is a deep state, is then, Steve Bannon becomes head of the FBI, or General Flynn
Yeah, I
is
was
now
gonna
in
make a- I was
control.
gonna make a joke.
What's the
I'll
worst
let you
case
do-
they
I'll
could do with all the mechanisms you're setting up now, and what can be done to sort of prevent
Well,
that from happening?
I'll weigh in and I'll let Carrie tackle it because there's been some coverage on it. At least in the case of DOJ, senior officials held firm and refused to let the election be taken in. This guy Clark, an environmental lawyer, there's new testimony out. They said they were going to walk out. They were going to do a mass resignation. So that was one pressure point.
So another pressure point was the Department of Homeland Security, which from my perspective, and a lot of work that we've done at CNS over the last few years has been focused on developing reforms for the Department of Homeland Security so that that largest federal law enforcement capacity can't be used and abused in a way that is inappropriate in a future administration that might not respect the rule of law. So there's a lot of legislative proposals that are currently right in front of Congress. The chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House has introduced a DHS reform package, and I think those legislative changes are important, at least as it relates to that department.
I also know the FBI was gaming out what it was going to do if it was faced with a situation in which somebody was going to be put there to use the FBI as an instrument of the White House. And I think people there were also prepared to resign in mass. I think that's it, unless you want to make one more.
No.
No. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, panel.
Sincerest thanks to Adam and to all the panelists for really content-rich and thought-provoking discussion. We'll take a 10-minute break and then reconvene for a terrific panel on foreign extremist threats.
off up here, they said? Oh, you should, well, go
Thank
for
you
it.
very much. To follow up on that really dynamic and fascinating first panel, our second discussion this afternoon will look at the shifting global terrorist landscape, extremism from abroad. Our moderator today is Eric Schmidt, who's a senior correspondent covering national security for the New York Times. He's been a member of Times reporting teams that have been awarded the Pulitzer Prize, wait for it, 4 times. Since 2007, he's reported on national security and terrorism issues with assignments to West Africa, the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia. He's co-author of a New York Times bestseller, Counterstrike, The Untold Story of America's Secret Campaign Against Al-Qaeda, that was published on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Eric, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you very much, and it's great to be a part of this great panel. It was a great initial discussion. I am start with a quick introduction. A lot of you all know many of the panelists here. My left, starting with Dan Byman, who's a professor, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and left is Samantha Vinograd, Acting Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security. And down on the end, we have Katrina Mulligan, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, thank you, of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict at the Pentagon. What we're going to do is have a discussion up here for about half an hour or so, and then I'm going to throw it open to questions from the audience, so please start thinking about those as we go along. But I thought we would start, and Katrina, maybe you could help us think about this a little bit, starting with the kind of threat environment as it relates to Afghanistan. It was just in October when Colin Kahl, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, talked about in congressional testimony that with the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, the threat from ISIS-K inside of Afghanistan could be within 6 to 12 months or so potential threat for external operations outside the country. That window seems to have moved to the right a little bit in testimony from General Frank McKenzie, the former head of CENTCOM, has talked about similar 12 to 18-month window for ISIS-K, but again, moving a little bit to the right when he testified just before he retired in March. But if you go by Dr. Kahl's range, we're well within that 6 to 12-month bracket. So I was maybe wonder if you can, from your standpoint, from the department's standpoint, give us a sense of the threat as you see it, both in Afghanistan from ISIS-K, as well as Al-Qaeda, and just how much the withdrawal of American forces really has affected the ability of the U.S. to gather intelligence on that threat.
So thanks for the question and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Before I sort of dive in on I think the substance of where you're headed with that question, I also want to point out that, you know, from the perspective that we sit in and that my colleague Sam Vinograd sits in, we're the ones who are supposed to be the most focused on these threats. And so we tend to think about this a lot, to focus on what we need to do to keep Americans safe, you know, so that hopefully others don't have to focus on it so much. There's no question that that events in Afghanistan, which you know, led to, you know, the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, but also existed before that decision was made, you know, gave us, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, we are always going to remain vigilant to the threat posture, but I do think that we became increasingly confident that there wasn't the ability to threaten the homeland. I think when there's also no question that if you have an enormous kind of apparatus in a country and highly trained and capable forces, there are going to be you know, access and placement that you're going to get and derive from that. I think what we have focused on in the post-Afghanistan time period is ensuring that we are doing all the things we can, whole of government, bolstering partnerships in the region, monitoring the terrorist threat so that Afghanistan can't again become a safe haven for terrorism. And right now we don't perceive that to be what is happening. But what we are also focused on is having a sustainable counterterrorism posture that allows us to both mitigate the threat that we know exists, continue to be vigilant about it, but do so in a way that is sustainable in terms of what the U.S. government is prepared to continue to support.
Eric, may I just add one point
Yeah,
to
please jump in.
Katrina's remarks? From the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, we think about the international terrorist threat, including as it relates to Afghanistan, in two buckets. They're related, but two buckets. We, of course, are extremely focused on the threat of terrorism emanating from Afghanistan. So individuals that may be in Afghanistan right now that may seek to travel to the United States or to countries external to Afghanistan. That is exactly why we have built with our interagency partners a multi-agency, multi-layered vetting architecture that involves multiple touch points, travel pattern analysis, and more. So while we analyze what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, from the department's perspective, we're very focused on all of that. Now, our ability to collect certain intelligence, and we can talk about this in the absence of having tens of thousands of troops on the ground, is a factor. But we have other ways to engage with, again, partners in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere on that kind of analysis to try to stop any terrorists from within Afghanistan from reaching our borders. As was written in the department's National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin published last week, we also remain incredibly concerned about the threat of what we call homegrown violent extremists. So individuals here in the United States that are not directed by a foreign terrorist organization, but are inspired by a foreign terrorist organization to conduct attacks here in the homeland. That threat of homegrown violent extremists, in particular, what we call lone actors, so a single individual, lone actors in small groups, is incredibly heightened right now. That pertains both to homegrown violent extremists and your straight up domestic terrorists. We have seen, for many years, Al-Qaeda and others targeting English audiences, online celebrating perceived victories. So when there was withdrawal from Afghanistan, narratives about what led up to that, and again, a perceived victory. And so we remain deeply focused on ensuring that, or trying to review how those foreign terrorist organizations may be trying to use propaganda and other kinds of online materials to inspire attacks here in the homeland.
But let me press you both, because as Secretary Call said back then, 6 to 12 months, he said ISIS-K could have the potential to launch external attacks, including against Americans in the United States. Do they now have that capability? And how would you assess the current over-the-horizon approach to monitoring that threat? And what kind of fidelity do you think you have to be able to monitor that kind of threat?
You want to take that first,
I'll
or
leave that to you.
okay, fun. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be in a position to dig into what the current intelligence analysis picture is, because that would be highly classified. But here's what I can tell you: it doesn't make sense to think about Afghanistan on like an on-off switch, right? We either have everything or we have nothing. What we have worked very hard to do is to build an architecture so that with our partners, by beefing up where we can in other places, surging resources, all of the things that you would imagine a whole of government response would involve, so that we can make sure that the worst case prediction that Dr. Call was talking about doesn't actually come to pass, right? That's the goal. And so I would assess that we've had considerable success in that domain. We definitely are, and it's continuous, right? I mean, this is something that comes across my desk on a routine basis. I'm sure it comes across your desk on a routine basis, ways that we can go even further. It's not like we put something in place and then that's it and it's done. We're constantly working to get better access, more ability to perceive what the threats are going to be. And I think that there's it's all very promising at this point, but nobody would say we're not concerned about it, right? We're going to continue to watch it very closely, and it could change. And when and if it changes, then I think we are prepared to take additional action to try to address that and mitigate whatever threat does end up getting emerging.
But ISIS-K, which was responsible for the bombing at Kabul International Airport that killed 13 service members, is it still now the main threat, the main terrorist threat coming out of Afghanistan? Would you assess that's the most immediate?
I think it's definitely one of the most immediate. Having come from very recently the Aqaba process in Jordan, the de-ISIS ministerial in Morocco, where I see the rest of the world's attention really focused is not as much. I mean, that's certainly a focus, but I think that many folks are beginning to turn some attention to focus on other regions, places in Africa where we're seeing new and different threats or worsening. I don't perceive the trajectory to be moving in a terrible direction right now, but we are watching it constantly because it's not something. This is the thing about terrorism, is that once it changes, right? And it has. That's been all of our lived experience over the last 20 years, is that whenever we declare victory or say this is now behind us, something happens and it changes the conversation. So I think we are working toward more of a sustained posture, a sustainable posture, so that we're resilient in the face of what could happen.
Dan, I wanted to turn to you and talk a little bit about the other threat, obviously, in Afghanistan and beyond. That's Al-Qaeda. You recently had an interesting piece with a colleague in War on the Rocks, where you went back and forth about talking about how serious the threat from Al-Qaeda, how serious is the threat today. Talk a little bit about, starting maybe with your assessment of where Al-Qaeda stands, of course, in Afghanistan and the threat it poses and its connections to the Taliban, now in government there. But looking, as Katrina mentioned, maybe looking beyond Afghanistan, where some of the other Al-Qaeda threats may be.
Sure, and let me add my thanks to everyone here for such a wonderful event. So I'm on the optimistic side when it comes to terrorism analysis in general. And I realize the purpose of panels like the ones we have today is to be pessimistic. And I'm delighted that we have people like Sam and Katrina who are keeping us safe. But that's actually part of why I'm optimistic. And so let me explain that with regard to Al-Qaeda. In Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was exceptionally weak. Right? It had been expelled from Afghanistan. It came back under the sufferance of the Taliban. Number of forces there were relatively small, a small portion of the Taliban's forces. They were not launching international terrorist attacks from Afghanistan, despite having a presence there. And the Taliban, we actually know a huge amount about this relationship. In the past now, we have large numbers of captured documents. Many people have been available for interviews. And that relationship was quite fraught. The Taliban in the late 1990s was not super excited about al-Qaeda operations. Now, of course, 9/11 happened, right? So maybe not being super excited isn't enough. But the Taliban, as it's shown, is a learning organization. It itself has not focused on attacks in the United States. That's not been a priority, even as it's killed Americans on a regular basis. And so Al-Qaeda in general is relatively weak. And important to note, right, we've seen, if you count Al-Qaeda and ISIS and unaffiliated jihadists in the United States since 9/11, only slightly over 100 people have died in the U.S. homeland. Now that's too many people, right? We want that number to be 0. But let's be clear, more people are probably going to die in the next few hours from COVID. Almost entirely preventably, just to be clear, than died in 20 years since 9/11 from jihadist terrorism on U.S. soil. Right? And so we need to have some perspective on this, and especially because Al-Qaeda itself, in my view, is incredibly weak. And for those of you who want a very informed, different opinion, read my piece, because my colleague Asfandi Amir begs to differ quite strongly. But I would argue this organization is beset by leadership problems. If you look up charisma in the dictionary under opposite, you'll see a picture of Ayman Zawahiri. He's someone who's been basically absent from the jihadist scene in terms of communication, right? There were rumors, quite credible, for many months that he was dead, and it took a while to disprove that. We have jihadists around the world saying, hey, things are happening like the Syrian civil war, and we don't know what to do because you're not communicating with us, because he's afraid of being killed by drone strikes and other attacks. You have a rival group, ISIS, that split the movement. You have tremendous pressure on localization. And whenever we get documents from within the group, it shows tremendous weakness. And I would argue it's a group that's much more focused locally, despite its rhetoric, than it is on striking the US homeland. Now, it's not a binary choice, right? It's not that they will only do local attacks versus only attack the United States. And I do believe that US counterterrorism is a very important part of this equation, that without US pressure, this organization would be much stronger. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that this organization has suffered many blows over the last 20 years. And the tremendous investment the United States and its allies have made in counterterrorism, despite numerous problems, has nevertheless paid off.
But Dan, Al-Qaeda's patron, the Taliban, are back in power now in Afghanistan. How would you assess that? I mean, it looks like so far they've kind of kept an arm's length distance, perhaps knowing that the Taliban are still trying to negotiate to get some of their money back, improve their stature in terms of the international world order. But aren't they just maybe perhaps biding their time? And the threat is still pretty serious there if the Taliban is back in business?
So this is, I would say, maybe. Let's be clear. The Taliban victory is good for Al-Qaeda, right? I don't want to be optimistic to the point of absurdity. And so it's a win in terms of their model, right? You fight the United States, you bleed, the US will eventually give in. And there is the potential for the Taliban to give them haven, not just to kind of live their lives, but to do international terrorist attacks. Now, in my view, the Taliban have a very strong incentive not to do that, right? Because it cost them tremendously in the past. And again, it's not the focus of this regime, right? Their focus is much more on Afghanistan. If there is going to be a problem with Al-Qaeda, I think it's much more likely to manifest in the region. Right? So my focus would be on Al-Qaeda attacks linked to Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and other attacks in the area. That's where there are a lot of ties to groups in Pakistan. There are a lot of ties to broader regional trends. And that's also safer for the Taliban, right? That if they're going to give this relatively weak movement a bit more strength, that it makes sense to do it regionally where the United States, frankly, is not going to care that much, than renewing attacks on the US homeland. The problem, of course, and I have to be clear about this, is there's just a lot we don't know, right? And it's quite plausible to me there's a lot that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban simply have not decided about the long term, right? So one always has to worry when a dangerous organization has the potential to get stronger. But at the same time, to me, to make very fast assumptions that any time that these organizations exist, they're going to inherently A, get stronger, and B, direct all their energy at the United States, that's the other end of the spectrum that's also wrong. But I think the fact that we have serious officials paying tremendous attention to this and will adjust resources if they see a problem manifesting is a relatively successful approach, at least for the near term.
Sam, we were talking before the panel started about the number of Afghans who came to the United States. Over 125,000 came out of Afghanistan altogether, obviously in a kind of a pell-mell approach. Talk a little bit about what you all have learned, if anything, after the fact about the threat any of those people who came out pose, either here in the United States or other countries, and those that are still waiting to come inside the United States. What kind of vetting is going through to ensure that somebody hasn't slipped through the cracks, to use the different means of getting into the United States?
I so appreciate you asking that question. I was actually going to answer it even before you asked it, in that I don't know if I'd qualify myself as a pessimist or an optimist. What I am is deeply focused on whatever our threat assessments tell us on mitigating the threat. And in the aftermath of 9/11, as Professor Byman knows, I joined the US government because of 9/11. I was in college when it occurred and went to the School of Foreign Service and immediately went out to Iraq after that experience. Post 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security, working with our interagency partners, has built and continues to build a multi-layered interagency vetting architecture, the purpose of which is to extend our borders outwards. Now, that's not just a catchphrase. What that means is that the department, working with the FBI, NCTC, DOD, and many others, works to try to prevent terrorists from Afghanistan or from anywhere else in the world from showing up at what we call port of entry, showing up at one of our borders, air, maritime, or on land, at the earliest possible stage. And we do that in many different ways. We do that through the collection of biometrics, so eyes and fingerprints, biometric and biographic information on individuals. We do that through information sharing partnerships with countries all around the world so that we are able to share terrorism related information with them. Again, well before an individual tries to buy a plane ticket to the United States. And then whenever any individual shows up at a port of entry, they go through vetting. When a foreign national is here in the United States, there are vetting processes that unfold during the time of their stay here as well. That vetting architecture, which we continuously enhance, is critical to our homeland and national security. And we are deeply focused on bolstering that and our partnerships and information sharing around the world. And it's something that I spend a lot of time on. With respect to having been deeply involved in Operation Allies Refuge, Operation Allies Welcome, and what will be subsequent iterations of this incredible effort to bring Afghan evacuees to the United States as quickly and safely as possible. We had a dual task here to help Afghans find resettlement here in the United States and to do so in a way that did not present risk to national security or public safety. Every Afghan evacuee has been vetted before coming to the homeland. Now, vetting, is a interagency process. It is a point-in-time check. If there's any new information that is received on an individual, that is reviewed with urgency. But I'm incredibly grateful that we have been able to so safely bring tens of thousands of Afghans to this country.
I want to move on from Afghanistan, and as Katrina pointed out, there are lots of other hotspots around the world. So Katrina, maybe we can shift our focus to Africa, both a couple of hotspots. One is in the Sahel, where we've noticed probably, at least my last trip overseas there was in Burkina Faso, noticed an increasing amount of violence in the Sahel area, a number of states falling victim to both Al-Qaeda and ISIS cells over there. And you also have the French, who have been the main security force on the ground, basically pulling out of Mali, and a troubling sign. They're trying to reorganize in a different mission in Burkina Faso and Niger, but things don't look good in the Sahel. And then over on the eastern side of the continent in Somalia, the United States is doing something interesting. It's putting troops back into Somalia. Not all of the ones that President Trump pulled out, but maybe 300, 400, 500 or so. They're going to be going in on much longer stints, which would seem to suggest that the over-the-horizon approach doesn't work, because that's what's happened since in the months since Trump pulled the forces out of Somalia. So maybe you could start us off on a discussion, Katrina, just looking at the threat in the Sahel, what the shifting focus of the French on the ground means, and why is it that the change is being made in Somalia with U.S. forces there?
So I will say Africa is a place in both of the regions that you just described where I think we are concerned, and where there's a lot of signs that are not pointing in a good direction. I think one of the things that I would note about that, though, is that it also argues for the strategies that we're employing in other places are being effective, right? Because now we're seeing the shift happen, right? And that happens when you have something that there's not a safe haven for them to be in, so you see things pop up in other places. I think that there are different drivers that are causing movement in those two regions. I think the thing that I would point to as kind of a common thread, though, is that this is not an area where a sort of tactically oriented security first approach is going to be effective on its own, because that really would neglect the core drivers of what is going on in those regions. And so the way that we're approaching how we engage there, it also frankly isn't sustainable. I mean, Africa is an enormous continent, and it is, we aren't going to be able to, send and put boots on the ground every single place that we might feel like there's a threat to be countered. What we are doing instead is working by, with, and through partners in ways that are very tangible. And so let me tell you a little bit about what that looks like. Because when you say by, with, and through partners, I don't know that anyone quite knows what you're talking about. I work really primarily with the Special Operations Enterprise. So there are lots of activities that the department undertakes in the counterterrorism sphere that are not in my remit or domain. But the special operations world tends to be front and center on counterterrorism and counter-violent extremist organizations. And part of what we have developed over the last 20 years is a rather extraordinary capacity for our forces to go in and help forces that don't have the legacy and experience and training and all the other benefits that you have in the U.S. services, to help them figure out how to do what they're trying to do better, to leverage our shared interests, right? Because in many of these places, the countries that are experiencing this problem are the loudest voices calling for help, assistance, something to do, where that's not the case, where we don't have that level of strength in the partnership, that's where we do need to take additional action. And I think that's what you're seeing happen in Somalia. And I think, the ability to be there creates pathways for more sustained pressure across a number of different areas, so that we can constrain the threat and mitigate the threat in a way, and so that our forces are more effectively able to support the partners that are in the region in the way that they need to be supported to be effective. So that's been the approach. What I will say is that, much like the process that Sam Vinograd just talked about with DHS, these are approaches that are being effective, because we are seeing, and there's evidence, indicia of the effectiveness of these approaches. But it's hard to tell, right? Nobody ever celebrates the absence of a terrorist attack. We only ever think about when something goes wrong, right? But you look at what the process that Sam just described is actually remarkable, that we have brought in so many people into this country from Afghanistan and done so safely. It is, especially on the timeline that it happened. So it's a sign that some things are going right, even though occasionally some things go wrong, and we have to, and we do better.
Are there threats coming out of Africa that directly affect the homeland? And this is for either one of you, or are we really talking about a regional threat? I'm thinking like Manda Bay, the attack against U.S. forces there. I know there's been some argument made by Africa Command that Al-Shabaab actually could pose some kind of direct threat to the homeland with another airline type plot. And I'm just wondering how serious that really is.
I think it's always we in the government, and particularly in the intelligence community, which I used to be a part of, are always very specific about the words we use, right? And so could pose and do pose are different to us, even though they sound remarkably similar in rooms like this. I think that we are very focused on not allowing a threat like that to exist. I don't believe that we have a threat like that right now, but we always are, we always want to caveat that. There are things that we don't know. I grew up under the tutelage of former DNI James Clapper, who always said, there are secrets and there are mysteries, right? And so there are things that we try to find out, and there are things that we don't know. So we're always vigilant. But I don't think that the primary concern right now is regional, and the ability to build capacity to go beyond regional threats, right?
Maybe if I could just add, I often get asked, what's the biggest terrorist threat facing the country? Everybody wants to know. Is it Al-Qaeda? Is it ISIS? Is it Al-Shabaab? Is it domestic terrorism? And so I'll point everyone to the National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin that DHS issued publicly last week. We issue these periodically. Since the start of this administration, we've issued 6. The latest, we call it an NTAS, because in government we love acronyms. The latest NTAS notes that the most significant terrorism-related threat facing this country is posed by lone actors and small groups of individuals in the homeland. That includes, as I mentioned, both homegrown violent extremists and domestic violent extremists. And as we head into an increasingly dynamic and complex summer and election cycle, we're increasingly concerned about those lone actors and small groups. So as we speak about the international terrorism-related threat, again, two factors here. One is online, targeting English-speaking audiences, trying to inspire attacks here in the homeland. As you know, post-COVID travel picks up, we are just as vigilant in using our multi-agency, multi-layered vetting architecture to ascertain whether any international terrorists are seeking to reach the homeland. And then, of course, and it's a bit beyond the scope of this panel today, the threat of domestic terrorism is something that we spend an enormous amount of time on. And in light of reactions to current events, both recent and those upcoming, including the SCOTUS decision, the elections, and otherwise, that continues to be top of mind for me.
Can I jump in with one point, because I think it's worth pulling a thread about a subtle difference between actually the way that the two of us answered this question that I think is useful if you're not fluent in government, is that the role of DHS and the role of DoD means that we confront the same threats in different but importantly different and important ways, which is to say that what DHS is looking for is, you know, they are concerned about lone wolf actors inside the United States. That's not a DoD mission, right? Like we in the Department of Defense, we're not taking action inside the United States against threats like that. Now, we are part of the network of, that sort of provides threat information into the systems and the vetting architecture and all of that, so that we make sure that we're not having information over here that would be relevant over here. But Sam is absolutely right. The most likely scenario is not most likely, doesn't mean impossible, most likely is something that happens inside the United States with folks radicalized online or that sort of scenario. That's also the hardest to detect from a foreign perspective when we're looking at foreign threats, because it's not a foreign threat.
Right. So let me ask you about the organization, the foreign terrorist organization that's most capable in the last several years at inspiring these kind of attacks, and that's ISIS. And Dan, I want to ask you now, because ISIS suffered a huge blow in February. Their leader was killed in a special operations raid. There were reports just last month that his successor was captured in Turkey. I don't know if you guys can spill any beans on that, whether it was true or not, but that's
nice try.
Okay.
I know, no comment.
Trying to break news, doesn't work. But anyway, I mean, ISIS now, does this, you've got at least one senior leader knocked off, maybe another one, but certainly, you know, there's a lot of churn in this organization. Yet UN talks about still having 10,000 or more fighters on the ground in Syria, maybe still certainly some in Iraq. What's your sense? You were bullish on the ability to kind of keep Al-Qaeda down, but what about ISIS, both its ability to create havoc in the region, in the Middle East, but also, as we've just been discussing, their ability to reach out and unfortunately touch people virtually in this country and in Europe, they've done successfully in the past?
So I remain bullish, but I like the way you're asking the question. I think it's very important to sort out the international and anti-US terrorism capacity of a group like ISIS from its regional capacity. And this is an organization that did significant terrorist attacks, especially in Europe, tremendous attacks throughout the greater Middle East, and in the United States really failed
All right. Thank you. Again, I want to reiterate my thanks to Tom and his team. They've been a great partner for this program. I want to thank all of you for joining us for the first two panels, one on domestic terrorism, one on international terrorism. Again, my name is Seamus Hughes. I'm the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. On behalf of our director, Lorenzo Vadino, who unfortunately couldn't be here because of COVID travel, which we're all kind of used to having to deal with, of cancellations and things like that. On behalf of himself and me, I'd like to thank you for coming onto this campus. It's in fact our first in-person event we've had since the start of COVID, and I couldn't think of a better, more important and timely topic, unfortunately so, than this. So again, thank you so much. You know, it also happens to be the 7-year anniversary of the Program on Extremism's launch. So 7 years ago today, it was an idea on the back of a notepad, and now we filled a room and have the Assistant Attorney General giving a keynote. We've always strove to be a nonpartisan, just the facts, ma'am, approach to extremism in America, whether that be international terrorism or domestic terrorism. In this climate, it gets hard, but I'm glad we kind of kept our path on that. And I'm thankful for all of the folks that help us get to that point for the last 7 years, so thank you. But probably the more important anniversary, the one that you really care about, is it's the 1-year anniversary of the release of the National Domestic Terrorism Strategy by the White House. We all know the events of January 6th. We know that on January 20th, one of the first announcements from President Biden and his team was a 100-day review of our posture when it comes to domestic terrorism, and a reworking of Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the FBI, and a variety of different agencies to refocus our effort on a rising domestic terrorism threat. 850 cases, active investigations in all 50 states 3 years ago, 2,700 at least, and Matt might have updated numbers, 2,700 active investigations in all 50 states now. Clearly the trajectory has gone upward. We have seen with that strategy a request and a focus on basically 3 pillars: understanding the threat, getting that information to state and local officials; prevention, so increasing our work on terrorism prevention efforts; and what we have today as the keynote, the 3rd pillar of the strategy, which is disrupt. Right? How do we focus our prosecutorial abilities? How do we focus our men and women in the assistant U.S. attorney offices around the country on this rising threat, a threat of which does not lend itself to the statutes we have right now and makes it a bit harder to try to focus on it. So I'm very happy to introduce our keynote speaker today, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matthew Olson. Matt has been a longtime prosecutor in Department of Justice. He's held a number of senior positions there. I knew him from my congressional staffer days, and then when I worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, he was my boss's 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 boss. In fact, I don't know if you remember this, and I never told you this story, but I left as an oversight staffer in the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and I had written a bunch of oversight letters to NCTC saying, you need to do X, Y, and Z, why haven't you figured this out, blah, 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 as my brave 22-year-old self would have done. And I get over NCTC, and I'm sitting in a briefing room with Mr. Olson, and he looks over and he says, "What are you doing here? How are you in this room? Aren't you supposed to be on the Hill?" And I said, "No, actually, sir, I just took a new job. I work for you now." And he says, "Okay." And he slides over the paper, the oversight letters, and said, "You can respond to your own letter then." And that's what I did. That was my first job at NCTC. It was a learning experience and a humbling experience, of which I think harken back to a number of times. So is it a true honor to have a friend and a leader in these issues, and one who has made public service a keynote part of his life. So Mr. Olson's going to give some opening remarks, as long as short as you want. This is the benefit of being the last person before cocktail hour. After that, he will then move to the middle of the room, and Carrie Johnson, who's the justice reporter for National Public Radio, will lead a moderated discussion. Following that, we're going to try to end our best we can by 4. We will go over a little bit over. That's okay. We're all adults. We'll power through this together. There will be a cocktail hour from 4 to 5 in the hallways, and then around to the beautiful views of the Capitol. So again, thank you for coming today, and please join me in welcoming Matthew Olson.
Thank you very much. right. Well, thank you. What a great turnout. I mean, this is really awesome to see so many people on a beautiful sunny afternoon here to talk about these issues. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. Seamus, thank you for the introduction. Absolutely do remember Seamus coming over to the National Counterterrorism Center from Capitol Hill, where he was an ambitious, I remember an ambitious oversight staffer sending us letters. Anyone in this room, by the way, a congressional staffer? Are there anyone who's willing to admit that there are, or that is, anyone who is a congressional staffer should have the experience of crossing over to the executive branch and having to respond to the letters that you write. That's a great experience for you to have had, and a unique one for me to be able to say, okay, Seamus, thank you for these letters. Now you can respond on behalf of the executive branch. Honestly, Seamus, what you have built here at GW with the program on extremism is really quite remarkable. I remember when Seamus left the government in 2015 and started this program really from nothing, just an idea. I knew Seamus was somebody who had a lot of really great insights from our time working together at NCTC. And in particular, when we just talked about this, the work on what we called intervention, which was when we were identifying individuals who were on the path to violence. They were perhaps radicalized or becoming radicalized. We were seeing this cycle of mobilization among young people in particular, some of them juveniles, and we were very interested in creative ways to look to take them off that path, to intervene, and short of the FBI arresting somebody, which in some cases is the right answer, but not in every case. And so Seamus led the effort that we had at NCTC along with the FBI and Homeland Security to think about ways we could be more creative. And I think that mindset is what I see in the work of the program here now is speak truth to power, like you said, Seamus, thinking creatively and leading from a thought perspective on the options that we have when it comes to dealing with violent extremism of all types. So also I want to thank you, Carrie, in advance. I get a chance to sit down with my friend Carrie Johnson and answer your questions. And hopefully I'm still saying thank you when the question part is over. We'll see. I'm sure I will, however. So let me just, you introduced me very kindly, Seamus. I'll just spend a moment talking about my background and kind of getting into what we do in the National Security Division before turning to a discussion of the threats that we face and how I think we should be responding. So that's kind of the game plan. These are more or less framing remarks, and I'll hopefully leave lots of opportunity for questions from you, Carrie, and perhaps from you all if you have questions. So I know many of you from having worked with you in the past. Many of you I don't know. As Seamus said, I'm now at the Justice Department as the head of what's called the National Security Division. I started at the Justice Department, I hate to say it in a way, 30 years ago in the Civil Rights Division in 1992, where I was a trial attorney. Spent a long time as a federal prosecutor, worked on national security cases later in my career. I was the first career official with the new National Security Division, which we started in 2006. So think about that, new National Security Division. Before that, there wasn't a National Security Division in the Department of Justice. There were different parts of the department that worked on national security issues, counterterrorism, counterespionage, FISA work. Those were spread all over the department. The department, the government as a whole decided we needed to combine all of those into one new division. It was the first new division in 50 years within the Department of Justice, really with the idea that we need unity of effort. We've just gone through 9/11 a few years before. There was huge amount of reformation around the government with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, all with this idea that we're going to unify our efforts around counterterrorism in particular. So the Justice Department followed suit and created a single organization dedicated to national security. And again, not just counterterrorism, but also counterespionage, countering other threats to national security, delivering to the FISA court our applications for foreign intelligence surveillance. That founding vision of unity of effort, headquarters coordination, because these cases are so important that are handled out in the field by U.S. attorneys' offices, making sure there's consistency in how we approach these cases, acting as a bridge between the intelligence community and the prosecutors within the Justice Department, making sure that we're handling intelligence information appropriately, representing the interests of the intelligence community when it comes to prosecuting cases. Those goals, those aspects of our mission remain the founding, those founding vision remains the vision today. And I have to say, I was there at the beginning in 2006 to 2009. I left and did other jobs. I came back in November of this past year, into 2021. And I've seen both how much it's stayed the same, true to that vision, but also how much the division has changed. And how much, while national security remains the top priority of the Justice Department, the nature of the threats we face has changed dramatically since my last tour at the department, where we were really focused on counterterrorism, in particular international terrorism, Al-Qaeda, first and foremost, right? That was Islamic jihadist terrorism. That's what we were focused on. That has changed significantly, partly because we are also looking at nation-state activity in a way we weren't before, whether it's China, or Russia, Iran, North Korea, economic espionage, traditional espionage, transnational repression, theft of our intellectual property, malign influence on our democratic processes. These are now the focus areas for a huge amount of national security work in a way that just didn't exist when I was at the department before 2010. So that's a huge change. We've also added some work, and I just lay this out so you have an awareness of the span of work that goes on in the National Security Division. We're part of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We review the investment in American companies by foreign companies to look to see whether they create national security risks. We have a huge law and policy shop now. We deal with all of the appeals, law and policy guiding not only the Justice Department, but the entire executive branch when it comes to national security issues, helping American victims of overseas terrorism. So the work of the department, and particularly national security, has not only grown, it's become more complex than my last time. And really what that reflects is the nature of the threats we face. And we always are trying to remain, in alignment with the nature of those threats. And as I said, when I was first at NSD, the focus was on Al-Qaeda. Later, NSD focused on ISIS, of course. And every day we continue to be very focused on those international threats. But here I want to pivot a bit, because the other area, and I didn't mention this until now, the other area of threat that we are now focused on is domestic terrorism. And I want to spend really most of the rest of my time talking about how we think about this threat. As Seamus said, this is a particularly poignant day to be having this conversation, because it does in fact mark the 1-year anniversary of the first ever national strategy on domestic terrorism. The reality is that over the past few years, we have seen that the threat posed by domestic violent extremists and domestic terrorism has increased in an alarming way. Communities across the United States have seen firsthand the terrible costs that has been inflicted by acts of domestic terrorism. Of course, last month in Buffalo, a gunman killed 10 people at a grocery store, driven by hate, driven by racial hatred. And we've said that the department is investigating from the beginning, was investigating this matter as a hate crime and as an act of racially motivated domestic extremism. And this very morning, as many of you may know if you've been looking at your phones, Attorney General Garland announced that the federal government and the Department of Justice has filed a criminal complaint in this case, charging the perpetrator with multiple counts of committing a hate crime resulting in death, and committing a hate crime involving an attempt to kill and using a firearm to commit murder. All federal charges, in addition to the state charges that he was already facing. So as the Attorney General provided remarks about this today, as he said, these acts of violence not only terrorize the people who are attacked, they harm the communities where these occur. And I can tell you, as I stand here on behalf of the department, we are going to continue to be relentless in combating such acts of violence. Beyond Buffalo, we have seen acts of hate and acts of terror in places like Pittsburgh, in El Paso, in Charlottesville. I can also tell you that every day I get briefed, along with the Attorney General, by the FBI and by the intelligence community, And every day we are tracking our abilities to identify and disrupt other similar acts of hate and acts of domestic terrorism. Again, when I first started at NSD in 2006, some of the most acute law enforcement challenges we faced arose in this context, in combating terrorism. But now that threat is both international and domestic. So according to the intelligence community, the most significant terrorist threat to the United States is posed by lone actors or small cells. These lone actors or small cells typically radicalize online. They look to attack soft targets, targets that are hard to defend, and they use weapons that are easily accessible. And we've seen these threats manifested in two groups of extremists. And I'm going to get into a little bit of jargon, but this is how the FBI characterizes these groups. They both involve actors based inside the United States, and the two groups are domestic violent extremists on one hand and homegrown violent extremists on the other. DVE, or domestic violent extremists, are individuals who seek to commit violent criminal acts in furtherance of social or political goals stemming from domestic influences, such as racial or ethnic bias, or anti-government or anti-authoritarian sentiments. So in contrast to that, homegrown violent extremists are individuals who are inspired primarily by foreign terrorist groups, but who are not receiving specific direction from such groups. Think about ISIS and its propaganda trying to push people in the United States to carry out attacks inside the country. These individuals are often motivated by a mix of socio-political, ideological, and personal grievances against their targets. And whether they draw inspiration from foreign ideologies or domestic influences, once these individuals decide to carry out an act of violence, once they've moved down that path from becoming radicalized to being mobilized to violence, they pose similar and significant challenges to law enforcement. I want to stop and emphasize this point. So when we're talking about lone actors or small groups motivated by these ideologies, again, whether it's international or domestic-based ideologies, they pose very difficult challenges for us that we face every day as a law enforcement and intelligence community. Let me just explain why I think this is. First, because of the insular nature and often rapid path from radicalization to mobilization to violence, including the fact that they often have limited discussion of their plans with others, and they often use encrypted communications, that continues to be a real challenge for us. There are fewer opportunities for us to detect and disrupt their plots before they happen. Again, we're talking about often relatively simple plots. We're not talking about complex plots with lots of planning and lots of meetings and lots of operatives. We're talking about small groups or lone actors who move quickly from becoming radicalized to violence. Very difficult to detect and stop. Second, these actors have access to easily available and extremely powerful weapons. And look, we have to be clear about this as a nation. The ability of violent extremists to acquire military-grade weapons in this country contributes significantly to their ability to kill and inflict harm on a massive scale. The ability to gain access to military-grade weapons makes the job of law enforcement very hard when it comes to violent extremists. And then the third point I mentioned this is they have learned, and it's not it's common sense, to go after soft targets. Since 9/11, of course, we've spent a lot of money and a lot of resources hardening targets, government buildings, other places that we were concerned about as being targets. That's not an option when it comes to grocery stores, nightclubs, schools. These are soft targets, any place people gather. And so these extremists look to those locations to carry out their attacks. We saw this most recently and most tragically last month in Buffalo. So I want to emphasize that, in my view, I've been doing this now since at least 2005, and before then I was a federal prosecutor here in DC for 12 years. This is the most complex and challenging threat landscape that I've seen. We know that countering the threat of violent extremism inside the United States will continue to require sustained attention and resources, and we just need to make the commitment to rise to this growing threat while still maintaining our focus, as I said, on the challenge of foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which haven't gone away. All right, so with that brief discussion of the threat, let me turn now to just talk about our response. And again, I know you've had a great opportunity today to hear on both the international side and the domestic side from some real experts. I wasn't able to hear that, but I have a sense of some of the things they said. I want to just, in some degree of humility, add to what you've already heard about what we can do in response. And when I thought about what I would say, it struck me that the thing to focus on is that there is some good news. As much as that I've mentioned that this is the most challenging and complex threat environment I've seen when it comes to both international and domestic terrorism, I do think there's some good news, which is that our experience over the past 20 years since 9/11 provides us with some lessons that have been very hard-earned. We have built over those years a long and largely successful record of combating international terrorism. So as we look to confront this rising trend in domestic terrorism, we can bring to bear those insights that what we've learned from our fight against international terrorism. Now, there are going to be key differences, and I'll touch on those. But I do want to highlight some of the ways in which I think our 20 years of experience going after Al-Qaeda and ISIS provides us with some really important lessons going forward when it comes to domestic terrorism. So first, and I already mentioned this once, I'll say it again, our work has to be driven by the threat. And sometimes this sounds easier to say than it is in practice. I know from my time at the National Counterterrorism Center with Seamus, and maybe some of you, every day we cared about the threat. Our responsibility as intelligence officials and intelligence analysts was to be clear-eyed and precise about the threat, to be nonpartisan, not influenced by outside, external forces, to really understand deeply the nature of the threat we face. So this work is already underway at the Department of Justice as part of the national strategy from a year ago. Early last year, the department issued new guidance to the field on reporting and tracking investigations relating to domestic terrorism. So how do you develop the data on domestic terrorism to help you build that understanding of the threat? We are taking a data-driven approach, and that's helping us marshal our resources and a nationwide response. And we're continuing to work to learn more, not just about the scope of the problem, but also about the nature of the threats that we face. For example, the intelligence community, and this is important, I think, recently said that racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, racially or ethnically motivated, and there's an acronym for that, REMV, some of you may have just heard that, I don't know, today, or you may be familiar with it in your work, are the most likely individuals to conduct mass casualty attacks against civilians in the United States. We know that white supremacist groups have the most persistent and concerning transnational connections. That's another area that we're very concerned about when we look for connections to other countries. But that's not the only category we're concerned about. While racially motivated extremists were the primary source of lethal attacks in 2018 and 2019, 3 of the 4 lethal domestic attacks in 2020 were carried out by individuals that the FBI has characterized as anti-government or anti-authority extremists. So this threat-driven approach requires that we preserve some operational flexibility, that we have the ability to shift rapidly resources, that we're agile in our approach, and it's designed to reinforce the focus, expertise, and resources demanded by the domestic terrorism threat, while also ensuring that these resources remain available. And this is a hard part for me as the leader of the National Security Division. When I have prosecutors who are counterterrorism prosecutors, how many do I assign? How many do I want to specialize in international versus domestic terrorism? That has to be driven by our understanding of the threat and some of the numbers and facts that we're able to build from the data that we have. So that's one. Second, in terms of lessons learned, we have to leverage the full range of our authorities to prevent and investigate and prosecute all forms of terrorism. So look, in the international terrorism context, we always talked about whole of government approach. We talked about bringing all tools of national power to bear, military, diplomatic, economic, intelligence, law enforcement, all these tools that we bring to bear on Al-Qaeda. When it comes to domestic terrorism, those tools and authorities are not appropriate. They're not the right things to bring to bear. What is appropriate and where much of the focus is on our ability to bring law enforcement tools to bear. So we look to the range of criminal and sometimes civil laws that apply when we see an act of domestic terrorism or something that looks like that. So for example, and I mentioned this this comes back to Buffalo again, acts of domestic terrorism also constitute hate crimes in many cases, not all cases, but many cases. And a hate crime, which is violence motivated by things like religion, race, gender, or sexual orientation, might also be designed to coerce a civilian population or influence government policy, which implicates the definition of domestic terrorism. So that when that happens, as it did with Buffalo, we ask, what is the best and strongest tool in our arsenal at the department that we can use to respond? And how can we be as effective as possible in holding those who terrorize victims and communities accountable and to achieve justice for those victims? So we found that when it comes to racially motivated violent extremism, such as white supremacist violence, hate crime statutes are often the most effective tools. And that's the recent events in Buffalo are a good example of that. There, the Civil Rights Division and my counterpart, the head of the Civil Rights Division, is taking the lead, and we are playing a supportive role in the National Security Division. We have a very close relationship between, and some people might not realize this, right? Because you don't necessarily think NSD, national security, and civil rights go hand in hand. But when it comes to these types of crimes, we work as partners. And in the Buffalo case, we've now filed hate crimes charges against the perpetrator. At the end of the day, this is why I say this is a lesson learned from IT. We're one team across the government working together. What's the best tool to use? Okay, so third, as with international terrorism, domestic terrorism cases are of national importance. Now, this is going to be a bureaucratic point, so bear with me. But this is really important. I think we learned this after 9/11. Sometimes these matters require national attention. Much of the Department of Justice, much of the FBI, much of the intelligence community is decentralized, right? There's field offices, there are stations around the world. When it comes to terrorism, the government made a decision after 9/11, we need to centralize a lot of the work from a policy perspective, from an oversight perspective, from a management perspective, to ensure that they receive the attention they need and the resources they need. So what we've learned from IT is, from international terrorism is, like, what's the right balance? Because we know that the work, for example, in the domestic terrorism front, the U.S. attorney's offices are on the front lines. The FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces, they're on the front lines of that work. So what's the right role, and how can we increase to make sure that we're playing the right role within the National Security Division and within the headquarters, main justice, to oversee, manage, ensure consistency across the country? So, as I said, something of a bureaucratic point, but I think it's a really important lesson that we're not just saying here in Washington, you all have it, these are matters for you to handle in the field, but we're also not saying these are solely matters for the national organization, for the headquarters organization to handle. Any of you who've worked in federal law enforcement, in the intelligence community, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There is sometimes a tension between the field and headquarters. Striking that right balance is a lesson that we've learned from international terrorism that we now are applying to the domestic terrorism space. All right, so that's 3. 4, and this is a really important one. We learned from going after Al Qaeda about the importance of partnerships, and for us that includes partnerships across the federal government. For example, with Homeland Security when it comes to domestic terrorism, it includes partnerships with the state and local law enforcement. We know that state and local law enforcement far exceed in number the number of FBI agents. They are often going to be the first responders, whether it's to see somebody who's motivated and on the path to violence or right after something happens. And it also means partnership with international partners, international home offices, prosecutors, and intelligence services. So at the department, just a few facts on this point. Each U.S. Attorney's Office coordinates a group of federal and state local officials in each district. So these are these small cells or groups within each U.S. Attorney's Office. We call them anti-terrorism advisory councils. They're made up of local officials and federal officials. Their job is to help train, develop policies at the local level, and this is something that was started right after 9/11, and it's proven to be very effective in the international terrorism space, and now we're deploying it in the DT space. All right, a couple more of these lessons. Our counterterrorism priority, this is the 5th lesson, has to be prevention. That's something, again, we learned in how we addressed Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is something that Seamus worked on. How do you think about prevention in this space, not just holding someone accountable after an attack as it occurred? So a lot of this requires engagement with civil society, groups like your group here, Seamus, the program on extremism. It requires us to understand the pathways to violence, providing support and funding to groups that are engaged at the community level. So this is some of the work we're doing. We do have some resources at the Department of Justice to provide to law enforcement agencies on terrorism prevention, hate crimes. We're involved in community engagement throughout the Department of Justice. Again, the lesson being that what we're talking about first and foremost as a priority is prevention. And then the last of these that I'll mention is maybe the most important. This is a lesson I think that we learned and really a hard-learned lesson from 9/11, and our response is that we have to remain true to our founding values, no matter the magnitude of the threat or the challenges it poses. These values, the values on which the country was founded, the rule of law, equal justice under the law, the First Amendment and freedom of expression, these values are our national strength, and they remain the foundation for all of our work. We are committed within the National Security Division and the Justice Department to protecting First Amendment freedoms of speech, association. We must cherish these fundamental commitments, even when confronted with words and beliefs that we find abhorrent. And believe me, that happens every day. Every day we hear of someone espousing a belief that is abhorrent and to anyone's ears not acceptable. But that is not a crime. Most of the domestic violent extremists who have committed acts of terror in recent years have been animated by hateful ideology, racism, white supremacy specifically. And we shouldn't hesitate to call that out as wrong and a betrayal of our core American values. And we have to be candid that those views are part of an ideology that is increasingly mobilizing individuals to commit acts of violence. But, as I said, hate itself is not a crime in this country. We investigate and prosecute extremists not for their beliefs, but for their acts. We prosecute people for committing acts of violence. We're committed to protecting constitutional rights and civil liberties of all Americans and to safeguarding the First Amendment rights. But the Justice Department does not and will not open investigations based solely on protected First Amendment activity. Bottom line is we hold sacred these rights to peacefully exercise those freedoms. When individuals or groups try to promote or impose an ideology through acts of violence, then those acts that are dangerous to others are ones that we can prosecute as crimes. All right, let me close with just a couple words on some of the work we've done within the Justice Department in establishing our response. In particular, creating a domestic terrorism unit. So last month, we stood up formally a domestic terrorism unit after consulting with a number of components in the Civil Rights Division and the FBI. The goal of this new unit is to draw on the expertise across our division, across the department more broadly, to prosecute and coordinate the prosecution of domestic terrorism, to develop training and policies, and support the work of the department in implementing a whole-of-government approach, including the implementation of the national strategy. We're trying to preserve flexibility so that this team can surge when necessary to go to other types of threats, but we really wanted to have a focused effort just on domestic terrorism because of the nature of the threat that we see. Just as importantly, this unit, as I just talked about, can be a critical safeguard because domestic terrorism cases raise issues about First Amendment and some difficult legal judgments and policy judgments that arise in the domestic terrorism context that we want expertise, legal expertise, to help guide our work and help guide the work of the FBI. All right, so I will conclude by saying, again, echoing what the Attorney General said this morning in Buffalo about the threats that violent extremists pose to the safety of the American people and to our democracy. For the Justice Department, confronting these crimes is a legal obligation and a moral obligation. These were the words of Attorney General Garland in Buffalo today. No one, when they go to the grocery store or their office or their place of worship or anywhere else should have to live in fear of violence or even the threat of violence. So, on that note, I will stop. I want to thank you again, Seamus, and the program here, and all of you for inviting me to speak. And Carrie, I look forward to our conversation.
Is this better? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Olson. I'm cognizant of the fact that the happy hour is after this, so we're not going to cut too much into your happy hour time. We have priorities. Let me start with this. I heard you make a little news about the domestic terrorism unit. How many people? How long has it been underway? Are you already at work at some of these cases that are now public?
Yes, so the domestic terrorism unit was something I talked about actually going back to January of this year, having taken a hard look at how we were structured. We formally stood up the unit last month. It does consist of dedicated prosecutors within our counterterrorism section. So just some numbers around that. So we have about 40 prosecutors in CTS, the counterterrorism section. A subset of those individuals are part of the domestic terrorism unit. We've had some people come in from around the country to help support that work on detail. It is, as I said, they will be prosecuting cases, but they also will be doing training and policy and what you would expect a headquarters organization like that to do because of the work that's going on, first and foremost, in the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country. And then third, really helping to implement the national strategy.
How closely, it's poignant for me to hear that you started in the Civil Rights Division and look at where the threat has gone, and it's right in that sweet spot. How closely are you coordinating with Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark? Are your teams talking all the time about how to confront threats?
I really appreciate that question because it would be difficult for me to even overstate the level of coordination. It is I think probably a daily conversation with the Civil Rights Division has a criminal section. And as you said, I started my career in the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. I was working on voting cases. My heart really, I feel at home there. And I have had a lot of conversations with Kristen from the very first week I started to understand how we could make sure that our teams were working well together. And what I have seen firsthand is that they, because it's just imperative that we do so. When we have an attack, when we have something like we saw in Buffalo, we need to immediately be making judgments about which direction are we going to go. What's the right charge that we can bring to bear that is commensurate with this criminal activity, that does justice in the case to the victims, both the individual victims, but also these communities. And there's just a direct alignment between the attorneys in the counterterrorism section and the attorneys in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division. Again, it's not intuitive, I suspect, for folks to imagine those two organizations being so paired at the hip, but I've seen it firsthand. And at the end of the day, we're talking about people who are federal prosecutors. So their mindset is very similar. They come at it with different statutes to work on, but basically, it's the same DNA. And that makes for a really powerful partnership.
One thing that really struck me from your remarks was your statement that the ability to gain access to military-grade weapons really makes the job of law enforcement harder when it comes to violent extremism. I know that you can't make policy on your own, but what needs to happen there?
Right, I can't make policy on my own. I feel strongly that when we talk about the nature of the threat, and this was true when I was the director of NCTC and I briefed the president and the National Security Council on the nature of the threat we faced, it's incumbent on us to be clear-eyed and precise about what the challenges are. And in this context, when we talk about domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremism, it seems to me that it is beyond dispute that the ability of an individual to purchase a military-grade weapon like an AR-15 and a clip that can hold a significant amount of ammunition poses a much more difficult challenge to law enforcement and to our country. Let's face it, this isn't just a law enforcement problem. It's a national problem. And so it is, I think, inarguable that the access to powerful weapons in this country gives domestic violent extremists the ability to carry out attacks on a scale that they couldn't otherwise carry out and that we don't see in other countries.
Yeah. The Attorney General told a bunch of us the other day that he's been a pretty avid viewer of the January 6th hearings. Have you been watching? What's your response to what you've seen so far? And I think you, speaking of Congress, you have a budget request in for some help there.
Right. So one of the things that we are working on within the National Security Division is being part of the effort to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of the January 6th attack, an attack that the FBI has investigated as a domestic terrorism attack. That doesn't mean everybody involved in it was as a domestic violent extremist. It does mean that at least as the FBI is opened it and pursuing it, it is being pursued as a domestic terrorism investigation. Our role in the National Security Division is really in support of the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., which has done a truly remarkable job handling hundreds and hundreds of cases. Our work in main justice is focused on some of the more complex conspiracy cases, and you've seen some indictments recently involving charges like obstruction of justice and obstruction of a proceeding, and as well as seditious conspiracy. And that's where our focus has been, as opposed to some of the more straightforward standalone cases. Although I don't mean to suggest straightforward, just more standalone cases. So it's a huge effort across the government. I like to point out that there have been, I think, 800 or so arrests or more, many hundreds of convictions through either guilty pleas or trials. I know that this investigation has touched almost every district U.S. Attorney's Office around the country, every FBI field office around the country, because remember, this attack occurred on one day and by individuals who then went back to their home district. So it's an enormous undertaking, sort of unprecedented in its scale and scope.
And I think DOJ is asking for more money to help stand up the U.S. Attorney's, the small but mighty U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and these other places.
Right, and it's something near and dear to my heart, having spent 12 years in that office. Those of you who may be thinking about law school or being a prosecutor, the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office is the best one in the country, and everyone in New York agrees with me about that. But one of the most exciting things about being in the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office is you handle all the superior court cases. It's the only district in the country that handles local crime. So I spent 4 years as a homicide prosecutor, and so but they are they all of a sudden have as many cases by one event as just about any other U.S. Attorney's Office in the country handles in a year. They're looking for help. We've made a number of requests to Congress to help D.C. for us on the domestic terrorism side. We'll see how that plays out, but there's no doubt that the resource requirements are extraordinary.
One of the things that struck me from your remarks was the idea that you can take lessons learned from all the work you and others have done on the international terrorism side of things and apply it to the present day threat, which is so complex and so challenging. I think I met you when you were just starting at NSD in 2006, and one of your jobs was to help close Guantanamo. So that was a big job. That was a big job. And progress has been made, but it's not done. What lesson did you learn from that you need to bring all the tools to bear, that you need to just think creatively, that you need to use the system that works the best?
Yeah, that's really, I didn't think about my framing of lessons learned in the Guantanamo context, but I think that's a good example, actually, that you raised, Carrie. Yes, it was really, so we met back then when I was in the National Security Division, and I eventually, in 2009, when President Obama came into office, and on day one, some of you may know, day one, he issued an executive order calling for Guantanamo to be closed in a year, and for there to be a review conducted of the then 240 detainees who were held then. And I led this interagency review to look to see, what category could these individuals be placed in, whether it was to transfer them to another country, whether it was to prosecute them, either in federal court or a military commission, or to continue to hold them under the laws of war. And so we did that in a year. We did that review. Somewhat remarkably, we had unanimous decisions by 6 different agencies who don't always see eye to eye on how to handle all of those individuals. But we certainly didn't close Guantanamo. It remains open today, obviously, although the number is significantly small. It's under 40 now, detainees, and there's some hard cases and some hard decisions to make, even about those who are approved to be transferred, what countries they can go to. In some cases, they can't be repatriated to their home country, for example. But to your real question, what are the lessons that you can draw? One, I do think, is not to prejudge the right tool and the right authority. And if there's an enduring lesson for me, is the value of our federal courts and the efficacy of our federal court system and our criminal justice system in the United States of trying terrorism cases. I just think, I think it's beyond question that our federal courts have proven that they are up to the task of holding accountable people who commit crimes against the United States and of international terrorism, that they can be set, that they are, the trials are fair and open, their convictions are obtained where they're appropriate, that they serve long sentences, that we protect classified information, all the things you would be concerned about in an international terrorism case. Federal courts have just proven time and time again that they're up to that task. And I think it's an open question whether the military commissions can live up to that standard. I'll go to another lesson learned, and that's remaining true to our values. When we think about the next time we have an attack or the next time we're challenged with a national security threat, we need to anchor our response in our values of the rule of law and equal justice and transparency, where we can be transparent and open with the American people. Like, these should be the guideposts for us every time we confront a challenge, and then we'll be much more likely to make the right decision.
One thing I like to ask government officials who have access to a steady stream of threat information is, what worries you the most right now? I mean, you said it's the most complex and challenging environment you've seen in 15, 20 years.
Right. Well, it's hard to pick one thing in response to that question, and I hope I don't keep anyone up tonight by answering your question. It certainly is the domestic terrorism context that we're talking about today, and the threat we face, and for all the reasons I said, and what seems to be a sort of increasing pace of domestic violent extremists moving to violence, and that has to be part of the response to your question about what keeps me up. But a little bit off topic, one of the things that we do in the National Security Division is we are responsible for the Justice Department's response to all nation-state cyber attacks and cyber threats. So we are tracking the work of the Chinese government in carrying out economic espionage through cyber against the United States. We are certainly tracking what Iran is doing in that same space in terms of our critical infrastructure. And then probably most significantly, we're very concerned about Russia. As the pressure increases on Russia through sanctions, through the military, what's happening militarily in Ukraine, we continue to be very concerned that Russia, because of its capabilities, which are significant, could seek to carry out a cyber attack in the United States against critical infrastructure here. They've proven their ability to carry out both what we consider disruptive attacks, but most concerningly, destructive attacks. As we increase the pressure on Putin and the Kremlin, as we seek to continue to isolate Putin because of the invasion of Ukraine, as we go after oligarchs and the support system, the concern we have is that we will see a response in cyber that will affect something as significant as our critical infrastructure. And so it's a really big challenge. And so in thinking about that question, Carrie, I'd have to stop with that. There are others, but I think that's probably enough for you all for today.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I know you and the FBI are on top of a lot of that real-time reporting. I want to close with a question again about domestic extremism, and the idea that in a number of these cases, these horrible tragedies that we've seen this year alone, you may not be able to speak to the specific facts, but people who have gone on to shoot and kill large numbers of folks, including little children in school, have broadcast some of their plans in advance on social media, have communicated online with others about the nature of the threats that they wanted to pursue. What is the lesson for us as people about our responsibility to each other, outside of the prosecutorial context?
Well, that's a big question. I think I would say the place I would start is just in this room where you have this many folks, many of you younger, students and beginning your careers, it's heartwarming to see you all here and being committed to learning about and thinking about really hard challenges and what our policy responses can be. So, as a kind of community of committed, thoughtful people, this is the beginning, right? This is sort of the beginning, the first stone in the pond that ripples out, in my view, to the broader community. The challenge when it comes to the types of attacks we've seen is that so often, this is true in the international terrorism, when it comes to homegrown violent extremists who are inspired by ISIS, for example, or a school shooter, there are often going to be people close to those individuals who see these signs. And I think, maybe the point, and I've made this in many different groups, but the thing that we can do in government is to build trust with these communities so that we're seen as, trusted partners, so that they are comfortable, whether you're an educator, a teacher, a social worker, a religious leader, or a family member, coming to law enforcement, coming to the local police, going to the FBI and saying what you know. And that's ultimately that's how we're going to tackle this challenge. And I do think where I see us having a responsibility in the government is in building those bridges, building that trust to give people in the community the confidence that they can come to us.
Thank you for your time, Assistant Attorney General Olson. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie and Mr. Olson for that lovely talk. Just to wrap up, I wanted to again thank all of you for coming today. I want to thank Tom and the Project on Media and National Security, and on behalf of our director, Lorenzo Vidino, and the rest of the team at the Program on Extremism, thank you for coming. I think 4 hours of talking about terrorism, extremism in America warrants a drink, right? So we will have a number of beverages available to those who are of age. I'm looking at you, students. There are drinks there. They're in the hallway, and feel free to take the views of the Capitol. Thank you again for coming, and I really appreciate all the effort.